Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. From the Globe and Mail, this is Machines Like Us. So it seems like the loudest voices in AI often fall into one of two groups. There are the boomers, the techno-optimists that think AI is going to bring us into an era of untold prosperity. And then there are the doomers, who think there's a good chance AI is going to lead to the end of humanity as we know it. Well, these two camps are in many ways completely at odds with one another. They do share one thing in common. They both buy into the hype of artificial intelligence. But when you dig a little deeper, it becomes clear that both of these visions, the utopian one and the doomy one, are based on some pretty tenuous assumptions. For the past decade, Kate Crawford has been trying to understand how AI systems are actually built. She's the co-founder of the AI Now Institute, a leading AI researcher at Microsoft, and the author of Atlas of AI, Power, Politics, and the Planetary Cost of AI. Crawford was studying AI long before this most recent hype cycle. So I wanted to have her on the show to explain how AI really works. Because even though it can seem like magic, AI actually relies on huge amounts of our data, cheap labor, and natural resources. She calls it the largest superstructure humans have ever built. Which means that even if AI doesn't lead to utopia or take over the world, it is transforming our planet. And that's something we should be paying attention to. So much of your work is about documenting what goes into the systems of AI.
Right.
Before we get there, though, what do you think people understand AI to be now? Like, what do they think this thing is when they engage with that chatbot or use a plugin to their Word document or whatever it might be?
Right. Well, unfortunately, I think there's a common misperception that they're dealing with a costless technical infrastructure that is somehow immaterial. It's just mathematics. It's, predictive algorithms in the cloud that have no material footprint. And it's completely understandable that people feel that way because that's what they're being told. You just see this blank interface. So how can I help you today? These servants that are there designed to give you anything you need.
A small prompt box, and that's your only window into the whole thing.
Type anything you like, and you can receive an image, or you can get help with your homework, or you can ask it a personal question. It seems like such a harmless interface and quite a light infrastructure. But in actual fact, when we look at what AI is truly made of, and this is certainly what I've been studying for the last decade, you see it is in fact the opposite. It is one of the most energy-intensive, water-intensive, mineral-intensive infrastructures at planetary scale that we have ever built as a species. I mean, it is truly astronomical.
So do you think this is the biggest physical thing we've ever done, even though we think of it as...
I think actually it is the largest superstructure that the species has ever built. And you can really look at that in different ways. You can look at that in terms of the capital investment. I mean, we're now hearing about, there's a set of companies now building $100 billion AI supercomputers. So once you look at what are the costs from a non-renewable resources perspective? What are the costs from a human labor perspective, which is all the people training those data sets, working with the models day in, day out, generally in the global south? And then what are the data needs of this gigantic system just sucking data in at scale? You are really looking at something that we have never built before. And that material footprint is now so vast that it is an extraordinary problem for us that we're not discussing because you don't see it when you engage with it. You have no sense of that.
When we started the show, I've been sort of immersing myself in the current discussion about AI. But I want to talk to a lot of people who have been in this for a much longer period of time. And obviously, you're sort of at the top of the list here. And for as long as I've known you, you've been working on and in and around and adjacent to AI. So I'm just really curious, now that it's in the moment we're currently in, what sort of surprised you about this most recent iteration of the AI debate?
Look, it's been fascinating because if I track back to when I first started researching AI as planetary scale technology that was going to impact us in so many different ways. Back then, if I told people I study and research AI, they would sort of look at me strangely and be like, really? You mean that kind of, science fiction futures? I'm like, no, this is actually here.
But you had to convince, I remember you convincing people that AI, not social media or not, it was important in and of itself.
Yes, that in so many ways, social media was really just a platform and it would be part of a set of systems that would be ingested into AI. So in some ways, there's very little that surprises me about the architectures and the scale and the impact. But what has surprised me has really been, I think, the degree to which people are accepting systems in these very early nascent forms, which are very prone to error, very prone to producing information that is either incorrect or, adjacent to what they need or in other ways problematic. And that shift from really systems that had training wheels on that were experimental being piped into the absolute central nervous system
of everything we do, how we work, how we think, how we
business, of social institutions, of education, of healthcare. That being so rapid was a surprise to me. It really was, in the last 18 months, an extraordinary speeding up of the logics and the systems that I'd studied for so long.
What explains that? Why were people so willing to just let this thing into their, was it the promise of utility or benefit or?
There's different ways to look at it. I mean, we can look at this in terms of the novelty factor, the fact that, 18 months ago, ChatGPT comes out and you suddenly have a conversational interface.
Yeah.
And that is so pleasing. And in some ways, it just gives you a very different relationship to an information system. And there are reasons for that I find really fascinating. I mean, you can go all the way back to the 1960s, where Joseph Weizenbaum, is at MIT, and he's creating essentially the first chatbot called Eliza. And, Eliza was very, very simple. She was really just a set of scripts, modeled on a Rogerian psychotherapist who would sit with you and you'd say, oh, I've had a bad day. And you'd say, but why was your day bad?
Thank you for asking. It wants to know.
Yeah, work was like, why was work hard? So it's really just a series of asking questions based on what you said. But people responded to it so strongly, feeling as though this was an intelligent system, to the degree to where, Weizenbaum's secretary would say, leave the room, I'm talking to Eliza, I need to find out what she thinks. And so that personal connection was what was so interesting. And he saw that. And he completely changed from being an AI booster, this is really exciting, to being genuinely concerned. His view was that we are so wired to anthropomorphize anything that is in conversation with us. We will ascribe intelligence to it. We will ascribe powers to it far beyond its capacities.
Yeah.
And what he saw then is exactly what we have seen so far, that conversational interface means that people ascribe far greater capacities to it and are far more forgiving and feel as though they are dealing with, if not a human, certainly an anthropomorphic entity.
Because humans make mistakes, so why wouldn't this thing that I'm engaging with make mistakes?
Precisely. We're deeply, in some ways, we are very forgiving of those mistakes, even when a system is telling us to, eat rocks or put glue on a pizza, which indeed they have been. So that's extraordinary that we have given this free pass to information systems that, for decades have been sold to us as reliable, as trusted sources, that when they suddenly flip into this conversational mode and start giving us answers that are hallucinatory, deeply problematic, in some cases directly harmful, that there's a kind of, oh, well, we're just learning. This is how it goes.
Collectively, we're all in this together.
Precisely,
we can't get it.
Precisely.
So, OpenAI would say they didn't think the initial ChatGPT was going to have that effect.
Right.
What do you make of that?
I believe them. I mean, I absolutely believe them. I think in so many ways, you can see what happened with ChatGPT. It didn't even have the technical infrastructure to scale to 100 million people in 2 months. They weren't ready. And then you can see what happened.
But it sounds like they should have been. If they'd looked at a moment of that history of our relationship with these kinds of technologies.
You could say that, but I do think it certainly surprised them. And it sort of came out of this sort of pandemic moment where I think people were really sort of looking for the new thing. And so it really took on a type of cultural power that I think surprised everybody.
Yeah. Let's start with the data piece. So that's evolved considerably since you started looking at inputs. So it seems to me some of the early work you did or talked about sort of relatively static data sets that were collected on images, or we're now in a different place. So what goes into a model like GPT-4, one of these big frontier models? Like, what is the scale and what are they pulling?
I think, Taylor, the question is more what doesn't go into them.
Okay.
I mean, these are giant maws that are ingesting literally everything. Yeah. So we moved from the sorts of what are called training data sets, the data sets that are used to train AI models to interpret the world.
Which seemed huge at the time.
Which seemed huge at the time. When I began studying them, I began by studying ImageNet, which had 14 million images and text captions.
Oh, that's so quaint.
It seemed vast. I mean, it took me years to study that data set and to find all of the problems with it. But of course, now I'm studying data sets like Lion 5B that have 5 billion images and text pairs, which is almost at an event horizon of what is possible for humans to really study and understand. And
why is that?
Well, in the end, what we're looking at are data sets that are so big that nobody looks at them. It literally is the internet. So these are internet-scaled data sets. That is to say, every YouTube video, every Reddit post, every news article, every image that you can pull off any social media site. And now, of course, it's audio as well. It's every podcast. You know, terrifyingly, this indeed may also become part of what trains an AI system. So you are looking at every form of what we used to think of quaintly as media is now this kind of material input. It is the stuff that AI is made of.
What's excluded from those data sets now? So what don't they? I understand it's everything on the internet ever.
Right.
And that's a lot of things.
Right.
But it's not everything. So like
not.
What aspects of our lives and our cultural creation, our histories aren't in these data sets?
Well, things that haven't been digitized. So we could think about a whole lot of archives, historical archives that aren't there. Anything that is on a private network is very difficult to extract. In theory, there have also been limits around things like our email not being used or, information that you've put in a Google Doc. And one of the things I've always done is sort of, press tech companies to say, what are you training on? And of course, what we found out with the latest version of Google Gemini is that they are, in fact, using Google Docs.
Is that?
If they are open and legible to anyone, then that is now part of the
That's worth pausing. I mean, that's remarkable because that perception is clearly not in the public that that's the case.
Absolutely.
So if your link is not private or restricted, as they would say in a Google Doc, it is being used.
And the same goes for YouTube. So again, people have thought of YouTube as a space where you could put up some videos. Maybe it's videos of your kids. Maybe it's you doing a chat like this, and let's just put up on YouTube. That is absolutely all being used.
And our email? Do we know if they're using Gmail too?
Well, interestingly, no.
Okay.
The policy has been that they are not using email. So
it's probably a bit of a red line still at this point.
I hope it's a red line, and perhaps somebody will be able to tell us. But in the end, we're relying on people inside tech companies being whistleblowers and telling us when those things happen, because they should be red lines, absolutely. But what we're seeing right now is almost a limit. We're hitting a limit of where you can get data from. So what's being seen at the moment in the tech industry is a hunger for data that is now so serious that the existing public data has already been used, already been extracted. So now it's how do we get to private data? And so interestingly, what we've seen in the case of Meta, for example, is that they were very seriously considering buying Simon & Schuster, the publisher, just to get all of the data to say, we can digitize and use all of these books.
It's probably cheap when you look at it in the realm of tech acquisitions. Like, I can't imagine it's that expensive.
That's correct. So, but this is just a tiny inkling of what's happening, which is there's an enormous number, thousands upon thousands of deals that are being cut as we speak of tech companies trying to get to information sources that are
So
not
that's why you see the
public.
journalism deals, for example, or are
Precisely.
they going into archives? And are they
Academic
heading
journals are extremely in demand right now. It's funny,
which is hilarious.
Those of us in the academy have always been told that the average journal article is only read by 5 or 6 people. Right. And of course, now these are the hottest properties.
Now we can appear in a hallucination free of charge.
Now your information can be used to create potentially really problematic misinformation. So that's now really the race is on to collect all of those forms of data that had previously been off limits.
It's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
One of the early concerns of these data were that they had biases embedded in them. They were exclusionary for all sorts of people who didn't participate in the creation of them. Now we have way more data. How do you think of the question of bias now?
It's interesting. I think that the problem of bias is absolutely inherent in the way that these systems work. And of course, the narrative that we've been told for a very long time is that the more data we have, the less biased they will become.
Yeah.
And then we were told, well, they're biased, yes, but we can technically de-bias them by coming up with systems that randomize whether you see an image of a white man if you search for CEO or doctor. And then we were told, well, but we don't want to overcorrect. So, basically if the data tells us that, doctors look like white men, then that's what we'll show you. And that's tragically where we're at. In fact, I was, recently doing some testing of GPT-4o with my 11-year-old. In fact, we were just sort of, saying, oh, well, let's ask it to generate pictures for us. And, we requested it to, create an image of a doctor, and it was a white guy. And we said, well, let's ask for a few more and maybe we'll get different looking people. No, we did not. It was just white guys. But then we said, well, what about a nurse? And of course, we started to see white women. And then we said, well, what if we ask for it to generate an image of a criminal? And we got a mixed race man in a hoodie in a back alley. So again, that's a very specific vision of crime. And then we asked, well, what about a genius? And again, we got a white guy. And parent, we got a woman of color, interestingly. And so it was this very, very gendered, very stereotypical vision.
What's going on there?
Well, what is going on there is really a system where I think people haven't given enough thought to the power of images. Many years ago now, I wrote a paper with a couple of colleagues where we really looked at basically the idea of representational harm, how systems represent the world can actually ingrain forms of harm. This goes beyond the idea of bias, but actually, what is the work that images do in the world? And this is something that we're seeing over and over again, is that I think not enough thought is being given to the fact that the minute you are taking a request from a text box and generating an image, you are taking a position on what the world actually looks like. And that is a form of politics. So these systems are really political engines, and they're so rarely thought of as such that those decisions that are made in small rooms of, a few people in a tech company are actually deciding what the world looks like and how we will see others and see ourselves. That is a profound responsibility that I think in so many ways is being, at the very least, underrated in terms of just how powerful that is.
Is the Grok-Gemini debate a manifestation of this?
Right.
I mean, we have Google's AI, Gemini, being criticized for being too woke, for generating images of black Nazis. And on the other side, we have Elon Musk's AI, Grok, which has been designed to be explicitly anti-woke. So is this debate surfacing the politics of these systems?
Right. I mean, it's interesting because, of course, their vision of politics is the decision of, whether or not a model is going to allow for forms of racist or sexist speech. And if it does, then Elon Musk says...
Then it's neutral.
Then it's quote-unquote neutral. Yeah. And if it doesn't, then it's quote-unquote too woke. I mean, how ridiculous when all of these decisions, whether or not you decide to just take the internet as your input and then just train a model on it, that is a political decision. If you decide to remove really, offensive or in some cases illegal material, which they should, then this is also putting a foot on the scale. If you decide that certain words or representations are problematic, this is also politics. It's politics all the way down. And so that's the realization that I'm hoping people are now starting to have, that the minute you train a system, you're making a set of political decisions that will impact the world more broadly. And this is actually quite new because in many cases, if we rewind even just 10, 15 years ago, so many of these models were just in labs. And now these models are being generated and then released very quickly to live test them on an audience of billions of people. And so that's what we're starting to see as well, is that, models will get released that are clearly not ready for prime time. Gemini, was withdrawn initially because it was, again, so, shall we say, ham-fistedly attempting to shift representation such that if you'd said, show me a Civil War general, you would see a black woman on a horse and you'd be like, wait a minute, this actually doesn't make sense. You can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to
Was it a human that would have, how did that happen? What's your analysis of how that happened?
Right. Well, that's created by something called prompt injection. You have your prompt box and you say, show me a picture of a Civil War general on a horse. It will randomize the representation of the gender and race of the person that you were seeing. And that was a choice that was made really to address what we were discussing, which is that if you just take the internet as your input, you are going to get highly stereotyped imagery. So it shows you yet again that this idea of that we can quote unquote technically debias is actually much harder. And in fact, that the field is not in many ways taking responsibility for those decisions from the entire pipeline, because all of the emphasis right now is on speed, getting something out as quickly as possible to become the dominant system. Because if you're the dominant system, if you become the AI system that everybody uses, now you have pipelines of fresh data coming to you.
Well, you see that with like a potential OpenAI and Apple deal.
Right, because that gives you the coin of the realm, which is fresh data. And the data is us.
So these systems are politics all the way down, and they're also people and labor all the way down. Mm-hmm. How are people involved in the creation of the AI system we now use?
In so many ways. There is a sort of hidden supply chain of human labor behind everything that we're using. But let's take generative AI as an example. So now there are, again, it's contract labor forces. So tech companies use essentially contracts that allow them to be at arm's length from what happens to these workforces. But it is commonly workers in the global south who are doing what is now called RLHF, which is reinforcement learning with human feedback. And what that is people interacting with models. And these models will produce things that, can be absolutely horrifying, can be traumatic images, videos, texts. And of course, workers have to look at this for hours upon hours a day. And you can just imagine that horrorscape of what your day-to-day job is like, often being paid between, $1.50 to $2 an hour. And they are trying to really act as the filtering, the human filter, which is taking all of this toxic material and then trying to train it out of these models. So that RLHF form of the labor precariat underlies these models. And what's interesting, of course, is that the industry has been telling us for a very long time that all of these processes can be automated, that, people are not necessary. It's all just going to be, unsupervised learning systems that will be able to do this, and it will have highly sophisticated algorithms. Actually, the opposite is happening, and that you're seeing an enormous increase in the number of what are called crowd laborers doing this work. And we don't really have clear data on how many, because of course this work is often kept very secret. In fact, crowd workers are often told that they can't disclose what they do. They can't even talk to their families about, who they're working for and the work that they do. They have very little rights. They in many cases are told they can't unionize, they can't strike. And so this kind of work is kept in many ways invisible. But we know from a recent Google paper that the workforce is at least in the millions. So we're talking about a lot of people. Yeah.
In the Google context or in the global
No, they were
AI?
speaking of the global the global system.
So I'm kind of confused because I understood how labor was used for content moderation when we were talking about social media, because people were given a similar model, people mostly in the global south in large content moderation enterprises as low-paid, precarious workers following a manual on what was allowed versus not allowed in the terms of service of that company in making those decisions in a human way. When a lot of that was pointed out and made visible, companies argued, well, AI is going to fix this, right? We're not going to need all these people to do this. AI is this thing that's going to do it. But it seems like now was that just a head fake? Are they now just putting it in AI model training, which is just the same thing, the same kind of horrific content moderation that was happening in this other place?
This gets down to a question of semantics. I mean, if you call it content moderation, this is something that we've associated with social media.
Yeah.
If you call RLHF, that's a different category, but actually it's the same thing. So it's that this category of labor has grown and expanded and
become less visible.
So, it's interesting. Oxford University has a group called the Fair Work Group, which has been tracking the data platforms for this type of crowd work across, I believe it's around 33 countries. And they give a ranking to all of these systems. And there's 5 criteria around, their ability to have fair contracts, what are the sorts of experiences of day-to-day management, all the basic rights that you would expect, a fair workplace to have. And they ranked these systems and they found not a single one got to a passing grade. And so effectively in this new world of AI crowd labor, it is getting a failing grade across the board.
So beyond just model training or content moderation, whatever it might be, there's a ton of free labor going into these systems.
That's us.
Ours. What would it mean to even cost? Would it just break the entire model if we actually costed the inputs into these systems properly?
Some economists have tried to do this, and there have been some attempts to really think about data as labor. But of course, it's right through the system. So we could think about the free labor that we give every day by typing queries into those text boxes for, chatbot systems. We are, again, training those systems. But we could also think about all of our content, all of our messages on
now
message
our Slack
boards,
messages I hear
our
the
Slack
other day.
messages, our Zoom calls, our open Google Docs. I mean, all of these things that we have been creating are now being monetized, but none of that monetization is going back to the original creators. And of course, we could take that all the way out to, our most well-known creators are actors like Scarlett Johansson, or we could think about, musicians whose work is now being used to create models to, instantly create music where no human creator is being recognized. So this is right to the heart of the debate right now, which is why have we all created so much in terms of written work, songs, plays, videos, which is now being monetized, but none of that is going back to the creators. And it really is cutting to the core of a crisis that is happening in intellectual property law right now, which is, to me, absolutely fascinating and something that I've written about with legal scholars in terms of looking at the fact that intellectual property law is contorting itself to try and deal with this kind of expansionist use of, what is called, the idea of fair use, that as long as, you can take all of this data, as long as you're transforming it, this is a fair use of that content. I think this is really being stretched to breaking point now.
Okay, I could go down that path for forever. But
it's fascinating, isn't it?
So the other thing that's being strained clearly is the entire planet.
Yes.
You talk about these technologies as planetary systems, and they take resources at a planetary scale too. So can you just sketch out first what resources go into the creation of these systems?
Well, this is perhaps the biggest untold story of generative AI in particular, because it is so much more resource intensive than previous forms of AI that we might call, say, analytic AI systems.
Which you were already concerned about the resourcing.
Yes, I already, wrote a book around my concerns around that. But, if we look at this turbocharging, every generative AI query is estimated to be somewhere between, 10 to 15 times more energy intensive than a traditional search query. The amount of energy currently being used by generative AI systems is approximating. In fact, it may have already overtaken several nation states. And that, of course, is on a planet already under strain. In fact, Sam Altman at Davos just a few months ago said publicly we could be looking at an energy crisis because of these new AI systems. And that was a really extraordinary public admission, which has not been made before, by a CEO who is in many cases driving these systems that use so much energy. So right now, what you're starting to hear, inside the boardrooms of technology companies is a shift to nuclear energy and putting a nuclear reactor inside every data center. And of course, huge problems with this. What could possibly go wrong, you might think. But even if these systems were secure from any types of accidents, which of course they're not, we still don't have a solution for nuclear waste. But instead, we're running headlong into attaching these systems to data centers because they are so energy hungry that they are pushing the existing electrical grid to its limit. And that truly is absolutely horrifying. But if that's not enough, it's not just energy, it's also water. Because these systems require so much energy to run, that also produces heat as a waste product. So how do you cool these systems down? You do it with fresh water. That's coming from the same water supplies as our drinking water. And so there's been a series of lawsuits trying to find out exactly how much drinking water these large-scale data centers are using. And in fact, one in Oregon that was looking at a data center owned by Google in the Dallas found that it was using, I think it's close to sort of 28% of the drinking water of the region just to cool down that data center. And that is in an area that's already in a multi-year drought. So we have a serious problem here, which is that, data centers are using this very limited resource of drinking water. They're using vast amounts of energy and, of course, vast amounts of minerals. So we have a global mineralogical war around access to rare earth, cobalt, lithium.
And you've heard a lot about that, again, in this previous generation of AI. Is that being also turbocharged now? Is there a bigger frontier?
Absolutely. In fact, Elon Musk just a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times said, lithium is the new oil because it is in such high demand. For example, in your phone right now, you probably have about 7 grams of lithium, but in a Tesla, car, if you look at, say, a Model S, it has around sort of 68 kilograms of lithium for its battery structure for each car. So we're using an enormous amount of these minerals, which we know are in short supply. And it depends who you believe, but there have been studies by places like the University of Augsburg that showed that, we're looking at hitting an absolute limit where we start to run out of lithium by around 2100. I mean, that's tomorrow in, historical terms. So there is this moment where you're seeing essentially enormous resource grab that is going on. In many cases, it's quite hidden, but if you start to follow the headlines, you'll see that it's about minerals, it's about water, it's about the chipsets. There is a gigantic race to get these resources at it, and it's coming at an enormous planetary cost.
And the way some of the in the industry talk about energy, it is almost as if it's not finite, right? That it can be created with investment and potentially innovation in some spaces. But water and lithium, I mean,
right?
They're finite.
They're finite.
Are we going to have a constraint, a real constraint? If the models continue just needing more and more and more and more, if that's the path we're headed down, are we going to hit a wall here?
Well, you've just posed, I think, the question that keeps me up at night, which is, what does that wall look like? I mean, there are decisions that are being made by people every day to create AI in this highly energy-intensive, data-intensive way. It's not the only way. In fact, we're starting to see companies release what are called small language models that try to use smaller amounts of data, fewer hyperparameters, and ultimately less energy to run them. That, to me, seems like a path forward. I mean, even starting to really have this conversation about what would sustainable computation look like? Is sustainable AI even a thing, or is this an oxymoron? I mean, that's the debate that we need to be having. And certainly there are researchers right now looking at how do you create more energy efficient data centers? How do you create smaller models? How do we start to really advance a discussion where these systems should only be trained on renewable energy resources? But
all of that requires constraint, though.
It does.
Not expansion.
It requires regulation, but it also requires incentives. And at the moment, technology companies are not incentivized to restrict their growth to think about sustainability in the same way. And so it's interesting. We saw, for example, in the US, the first bill around artificial intelligence and its environmental impacts. And of course, this bill has not passed yet, but it had a very, very low bar. It was ultimately suggesting, voluntary commitments and, voluntary reporting. I think we're past that point. I think we need absolutely mandatory reporting of what's going on. It's extremely hard. For example, in my case, it took years to do the research to find out the energy and water imprint of these models. And even now, with every passing few months when we get a new model, it's
and what else are they? We don't know what else they're training or working on or what's coming next.
It's extremely hard.
Yeah.
And also what we're starting to see in the industry is a move away from open publishing, from telling us. So, for example, with GPT-2 came a paper where we knew something about what it was trained on, where the data came from. GPT-3, we knew a little less. But with GPT-4, no paper.
Yeah.
We know nothing about what it was trained on. We can guess, but we don't know. And so we're seeing the light slowly being switched out of being able to see into these systems. And that's a real problem.
I really struggle with this one. We have an almost certain climate catastrophe. And the utility of AI is not certain. And I can buy into some of the hype and I can see potential value. But you compare these two things, the certainty of a climate catastrophe and the uncertainty of the utility of the thing that's adding to it. What's the moral case for even continuing down this AI path? Or is there a moral argument for restraint?
This is the debate that the industry is not having right now. It really is this ultimate question, which is it worth the cost, the planetary costs? And ultimately, at the moment, the debate is so much about promise, potential. It could do the following things. And that's exciting. And I am just as susceptible as the next person to be excited by the fact that, we can create systems that can create new molecules, that can imagine new drug discovery. That's really exciting. But it is still in the realm of potential. And the downsides we're already seeing, they're already with us. They are here, from energy to the sort of exploited labor layer to the, information pollution that we're seeing from AI engines that are giving us generated answers that are incorrect or suggesting that that pregnant women should smoke 3 cigarettes a day. This is literally happening right now. And so we have to do, I think, a much more accurate accounting of what is the cost? What are the benefits? And until we really have systems that are much more robust, have proven their worth, that we start to think about sustainability from the very beginning. And I mean sustainability in a holistic sense for people, for the ecological systems in which we live, for our ability for our political systems to function, when we have misinformation being absolutely sort of piped into every single territory. And again, this is in a year where 50% of the world is going to a national election.
Yeah.
So, these are the sorts of real conversations that we need to have. And ultimately, it gets down to a question of responsibility and accountability. Who is responsible if these systems are ultimately causing genuine forms of lasting harm on a planet that is in a climate crisis?
So even beginning to have the conversation of that trade-off between potentially exacerbating climate catastrophe versus the potential expansive benefits of a new innovation requires knowing and requires transparency. And you have spent a long time trying to know these systems. And I think that's what the core thing you do, right? Is you try and understand what these things are. So who benefits from us not knowing what AI is?
Well, I think we can safely say that companies right now are benefiting from the ability to write off all of these costs as externalities. If these costs are not built into what it means to create an AI system, then you are able to just plow on ahead at high speed. And of course, this is the major motivation right now, is that we are in an AI race. And the objective has been be first to market as quick as you can. And what we're seeing, is safety teams, quitting en masse. We're seeing many people raising the alarm around what they're seeing. But when you're in a race dynamic, then it's speed at all costs.
At all costs.
And the cost is these questions around sustainability, responsibility, accountability, and transparency. Now, while I think certainly my research career has been around looking into what these systems are made of, how they are built, and then sharing that with the public and with the research audience in the hope that we can actually change these systems. I don't believe that transparency is enough. Transparency is not in any way a complete solution because, you can show people what things are made of, and if you have no ability to then
that
take
prompt's
action,
pretty enticing if you still want to use it.
If you still want to use that prompt,
yeah.
or if you don't have a regulatory system that can do anything about it. This is the ultimate accountability question: is how are we going to regulate these systems, and who has the power to do so? Because if we think about the unit of the nation state, it's not the same unit that an AI system is working globally. These are ultimately transnational companies and transnational systems, and you're working just with the armature of, a single nation state. So even at that unit of power, is that going to be sufficient?
Yeah. And that power is concentrating as well. That's the other thing being turbocharged here. And we kind of laid the foundation with that, with the first digital companies that emerged. But now it's the same ones who are just getting even bigger at this planetary scale.
That is the biggest issue. And I think perhaps, if there's a sort of a motivating question in my work, it's what is happening to power.
Yeah.
And what you're seeing right now is perhaps one of the most concentrated industries in history. I mean, you really have to go back a long way. We could think about what happened with the railways. We could perhaps look at what happened with big oil. But there aren't many examples of a very small selection of empires that have such global reach. And it is very difficult to restrain, contain, regulate empires of that much power, that much reach. And ultimately, that's what we're seeing right now, because these technologies are very much a sort of winner-takes-all mechanism. We talked about the fact that, if you are the one AI system that everyone's using, then you're the one with all of the data. It's very hard to compete with that. If you are, seen as being so necessary or so have such potential that countries won't regulate you, then essentially it's an open field to do whatever you want. And so that is not a very balanced situation for democracies, generally speaking. That type of empire structure does not go well historically. And that's something that I think a lot about is, how are we echoing those sort of structures of empire of the past, and what does that do to both the idea of equity, but also the idea of democratic participation?
So when you go back, your latest work goes back to 1500, the advent of different tracks, the emergence of different technologies and politics around them. Mm-hmm. Are there moments in that history where a new technology didn't concentrate power? Or is that just the constant thing that happens? Is like new thing, more power to the people who can take advantage of it?
Well, of course, there have been many technologies that died on the vine. And perhaps that's also a set of stories worth telling,
right,
because there is a trap, I think, where we believe that every technology is inevitable. If it can be done, it will be done. And I think we have to resist that. We have to, in many ways, question that inevitability narrative to say, actually, there have been many instances where, we as a species decided that a technology needed to be restrained, or in some cases tightly regulated. I mean, we could
nuclear weapons is the obvious one, but what are some other examples of that?
We could even think about the seatbelt. I mean, of course, the car was, invented and popularized long before the seatbelt. And that came much later as a sort of a realization that, the death rate of this system is simply not acceptable. Then we could sort of think about technologies like the player piano. So in the 1880s, we see this technology which could automate the playing of music. And it was seen as such a threat to musicians and composers that it became, the subject of congressional inquiries and lawsuits. And what we started to see is that, it became the creation of, in fact, the Copyright Act of 1909, which was very much driven by these sorts of technologies, because it was seen that just let to run rampant, it would in many ways sort of take over the role of the public performer. And so how did we start to create a system of royalties and music publishing that became the basis of the modern music industry? So there are these moments where you do see a technology become dominant, but also start to face forms of regulation. And so for us, it's, looking at the current moment, it's really interesting because we so often think of generative AI as being so new, so unlike anything that's ever come before. You couldn't possibly constrain it or regulate it. But actually, history shows us that we've had many technologies like this that upended forms of cultural production, but could, in fact, be productively regulated in a way that made sure that people actually more generally benefited rather than just a few.
I struggle with how that's going to play out here. In part, we've put so much agency in the creators to tell us what can be built and what can't. And it feels like that's just this train barreling down the track right now. And like, why is it up to them what's being built here? And what's the friction that can be added to that, or the countervailing force? And I guess when you look back at these previous examples, like, where's that kernel of opportunity here, maybe to not necessarily bring people back in, but to open up the conversation about who has agency on what we decide to build and what technologies we all want to participate in?
This, Taylor, is the conversation. This is the conversation that I want us to
Well,
be
it's my
having.
last question, so we may have to have another one.
Well, next time.
Yeah.
But look, we can look around us. It's already happening. We just had the largest AI-related strikes across Hollywood. We saw writers and actors walk off the job to say, we are not going to accept this sort of quite problematic deal where their work is going to be automated and it doesn't actually accrue any benefits back to them. That was a profound strike where, in actual fact, they won many material conditions that they were fighting for. And we're starting to see that happen, in many small pockets around the world. But you're also starting to see people inside these companies say, hey, there is a problem here. We have to start doing this differently. But in the end, it's going to have to be collective action. It's going to have to be at the point where people are saying, we want to see, large-scale policies around how these systems are built that have real impacts. Because right now, so much of that is happening out of sight that people are simply unaware. So, part of the reason for a podcast like yours is that we can start to open up those black boxes. We can start to have those conversations. We can start to see the planetary level impacts and say, are we okay with this? And ask the ultimate question, which is not what will technology do for us, but what kind of world do we want to live in?
Machines Like Us is produced by Paradigms in collaboration with the Globe and Mail. The show is produced by Mitchell Stewart. Our associate producer is Sequoia Kim. Executive producers are Kathleen Goldhar and James Millward. Our theme song is by Chris Kelly. A special thanks to Matt Frainer and the team at the Globe and Mail. If you liked the interview you just heard, please subscribe or leave a rating or a comment. It really helps us get the show to as many people as possible.